All the talk of how our economy has been on a consistent upswing for going on, 9 consecutive years now, with GDP numbers, unemployment numbers, housing numbers, all generally in an upward direction, or at least stable. There's one number that scares the hell out of economists because it's frighteningly high. And if we hit a recession, heaven knows how this number, this alarmingly huge number, is going to be reconciled. The number that I'm referring to is the corporate debt. America's corporate debt. See, corporate debt is the amount of money that corporations have been borrowing over the past 9 years. While borrowing has been so super cheap, it's been easy. It's nothing short of extraordinary where it is. And you want to know what that number stands at right now? $9 trillion. $9 trillion. I know you've heard people complain about our national debt, right? It's way too high as well. It's $21 trillion, but that's the public debt. That means our corporate debt, the private debt, is almost half of that. What were to happen if we were to suddenly hit a recession? You may not want to know. Richard Wolff is a professor of economics who is keenly aware of what could happen if our debt bubble does, in fact, burst. He joined me earlier this week from our Capitol studios. There's 2 areas we can go to, 3 really, if you include student loan debt, which seems to be somewhere around $2 trillion. The corporate debt in this country, which Richard will explain to you, which is about $9 trillion. And then our national debt, which is more of a public debt, which is around $21 trillion. Now, I know those numbers are huge and it's hard to kind of put them into perspective. So let's take them one at a time. Let's start with corporate debt. $9 trillion in corporate debt. How do we get there? What is it? And how much danger exists for us as a country with that big number?
Well, let's start with how it happened. You have to go back at least to 2008 and the crash of the American economy, the crash really of global capitalism. So frightened were the people who run the United States at that time, the big bankers in New York, the politicians at the Federal Reserve, and so on, that they rushed in to try to hold the economy from a complete collapse. And one of the things they did was drop interest rates to historically unprecedented lows. Not only all the way to zero, but on and off below zero, negative interest rates, which we hadn't seen hardly ever in our history. What this did made credit virtually free. And every corporation having any kind of difficulty over the last 10 years, and that's almost all of them, solved their problem by borrowing essentially free money. It was an opportunity none of them could forego. It was too delicious. It was a way to solve their problem that was easier, since the interest rates were next to nothing, than anything else they could have done. So they loaded up on debt. And now the problem is they're going to have a hard time in the years ahead making the kind of money they need to make to begin to pay off that debt, because especially now as interest rates are starting to go up, they're going to have a heavy load to solve in this way, and they're not prepared for it. And we have to remember.
By the way, I just got to say, there's nothing wrong with borrowing money to start a company. It's part of the American story, right? You Richard and Rick get together. Hey, let's start a restaurant around the corner. We don't have enough money. My uncle will give us some money, but we have to borrow the rest. That's fine. The problem, it seems to me, tell me if I'm wrong, is that's been flipped. It used to be you'd borrow 60%, you'd come up with 60% of the money, maybe borrow 40%, maybe 30%. But now it's the other way around. Companies are being built on like 80% debt, and they're only putting in 20% cash. That doesn't seem right.
Absolutely. Let me give you a simple example. They borrowed over the last 10 years, for example, huge amounts of money to go into the stock market and buy the shares of their own company. It's called a share buyback. Why would they do that? That doesn't increase their capacity to produce anything. It just reduces the number of shares. But here's the reason. When they go in and buy their own shares, they drive up the value of the shares. And many of the corporate executives doing that have pay packages linked to the price of the shares in the market. So this was a simple way to borrow money at no cost and boost their own pay packages, which went off the grid over the last 10 years. Another thing they did was to buy each other, mergers and acquisitions. Again, that doesn't change the productivity of our society. It's just a manipulation among corporations made possible and cheap by all this free credit given out by the government. So yeah, it has buried us in a corporate debt problem. We've never had this before at this scale. And if an economic downturn comes, as most economists expect over the next 12 to 24 months, nobody can guess what will happen when the companies that go down can't pay back the debts they've taken out, and how that will spread the misery across our economy. Very scary proposition.
Let me end with this number that I just found, and I think it's correct. I got it as I was researching this segment and this interview that I was about to do. It says that right now our banking or corporate cash to debt ratio in the United States as of the end of 2018 was at 12%. I'm not an economist or a financier, but that number troubles me as an American. Should it?
Absolutely. It tells you that if bad economic times come, and again, the majority of economists expect that over the next 12 to 14 months, an economic downturn. It tells you that for every dollar of debt that's going to come due, the cash that is held in the hands of the borrower is 12 cents, and that doesn't begin to cover it. So you could have a classic modern version of what we used to call a run on the banks, or a bank panic, or a monetary panic. And let's not forget, what led to the crisis of 2008 was the inability of people who couldn't afford it to pay back the mortgages they had taken out, and then the system fell apart based on that failure of the debt to be repayable.
I think even I understand it. If we get into a very difficult situation and you got there because you overborrowed, there isn't any place to go to borrow to fix the original borrow. So it's almost like a real catch-22 that we can find ourselves in. Richard Wolff, as usual. Go ahead, you were going to finish?
No, I just want to say that it is a very dangerous place we've come into, and that's why all this talk of recovery hides the fact that the things we did to look like we were recovering created a greater vulnerability than what we had in the first place.
Well said. Richard Wolff, as usual. That's why we like having you on. You tell it like it is. Thank you, my friend, for taking time to join us.
Glad to be here, Rick.
I'm Rick Sanchez. You found us on YouTube, and that's awesome. But you know,